Hello, my name is Andrew State and I am the CEO of the Pinnacle Foundation, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we are all meeting today. Today I'm on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in central Victoria, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be attending today or watching this presentation. WPP are a gold partner of the Pinnacle Foundation and have recently conducted some extensive global research beyond the rainbow, which we felt was very valuable to share with our other partners. I would like to thank Genevieve Murphy and Marion McDonald from WPP for making this a reality. Today's session is being recorded as we have a number of people who are unable to join us. It's Sydney World Pride at the moment, so many people are very involved in many activities. And so now I'm delighted to welcome Devon Esper. Devon is the lead author of the report Beyond the Rainbow and manager of strategy for Wavemaker based in the US, in fact in New York, and part of the WPP community. And Devon will share with us today some insights from this groundbreaking research. And I'd ask that you make Devon very welcome. Thank you, Devon.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the amazing welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this research. It's definitely important that we do this kind of research to better understand these communities. And so it's really exciting that WPP has supported us in creating this research so that it can inform more impactful work. I'm Devon. I work in Wavemaker in New York. I won't spend much time talking about myself because I'm not the star here. It's really the research. And like Andrew said, I'm part of WPP Unite, which is WPP's LGBTQ plus ERG, the longest acronym possible. But we really are a collection of people across WPP's global network, across different agencies, creative, media, technology, coming together to just create more impactful work and connect with our community. And so we have examples of some work that we've done. We've launched in India, we've launched in Canada, we've launched in the US. We've done campaigns for the human rights legislation. We've done campaigns for Pride in London. We've got a really rich wealth of content across all of our socials that anyone can access to kind of learn about our community, the work we do, and why it's important to do this sort of thing. And we've only been around for about a year and a half, so we're only just getting started, and there's so much more room for us to grow. Now, the Beyond the Rainbow report, it did take a village. While it is only me here today, it took a lot of people to produce this report. And so you can see here just the wealth of people that we have access to through WPP Unite to kind of create this kind of impactful and really rich research across 13 different companies within WPP. We had people collaborating and donating their time. We had 4 study partners from Diva Magazine, HRC, MyG Work, and UK Black Pride. And we also had contributing authors from Absolute Vodka and TikTok, really influential partners in this space who do really incredible work. And so our purpose with this research was to first and foremost equip our clients and the industry at large with really actionable insights to make our work more inclusive of our community. You know, every brand is trying to activate in this space, and it's really important that we do so, but it's really important that we understand this audience before we go to market so that we can create work that is truly representative, that is truly reflective of the community and benefits the community in the long run. How we did this was a mid-market survey by speaking to people across Canada, the UK, and USA. We spoke to 3,500 LGBTQ plus people and 4,000 non-LGBTQ plus people so that we can compare results in the questions that we asked between both a queer person and a non-queer person so we can understand the differences in these communities versus the general population. Now, within this report, there's going to be a lot of language, a lot of acronyms. And so we wanted to kind of start by saying that while there is so many spectrums of identities within this community, and sometimes we use terms to kind of catch everyone in that one term. It's important to note that there is no single one way to be queer, and while I may refer to the community at large as just queer people, know that there is so many different dimensions of our community, and it's important to have a really rich understanding of those different people. I myself, as a gay man, cannot speak on the experiences of everyone in the community, but for the sake of this report and for the sake of me not stumbling over my words, I may say queer over LGBTQ+, so that I can efficiently communicate during this presentation. So the report itself is split into 3 key sections, which I'm going to review today. The first being identity and how people see themselves and how they engage with the world around them. The second is media, and we're diving really into not just how people consume media, but what's drawing them to those media channels, how it's going to evolve, and how brands can kind of tap into those spaces. And then the last pillar of this report is focusing on communication and exploring ways that brands can connect with this audience, can tell our stories, and can show up in these queer marketing spaces and really have an impact and have a really rich story that they bring to market. So the first section is talking about identity, and we have this overarching theme in that the future of our audience and the future of our community is very fluid. So we wanted to first start by asking people just how they feel about our community, how they feel about attitudes about society. And overwhelmingly, most people feel that societies are becoming more inclusive of LGBTQ+ people, which is a really great stat to see. And a lot of people believe that sexuality will become more fluid in the future and that people aren't just one which way. People can express themselves however they want. It's important to note that these are just perceptions of our survey respondents, in that how someone might perceive our community may be different to how the community is actually played out and treated in the real world. So it's important to understand how people's baseline understanding is, but then understand what's happening in the market in real time. When we broke this down by gender, this shouldn't be a surprising number to anyone, in that Gen Z audiences are the queerest generation yet. Almost a quarter of Gen Z audiences identify as some form of LGBTQ+, which is a staggering number. And while it doesn't, this is just people who identified, and unsurprisingly, that number gets smaller and smaller the older these respondents get. I think it's important to note that it's not that these people aren't part of the LGBTQ+ community, it's that they're not identifying as within this community. There's obviously a lot of generational nuances that go in hand with someone who is 65+. They might not feel comfortable identifying as LGBTQ+. You know, I think we always get compared to that graph of like, when left-handedness became illegal, there was like this huge spike in it, and that people felt safe to identify. And we're seeing that within the queer community as well. Younger audiences feel safer to be themselves. They have access to more information, and they're able to express that freely in the world. We broke that down a little bit more in terms of the different dimensions of sexuality within our community. Younger audiences are breaking down kind of these binaries and boundaries, in that they're kind of defining themselves a lot more fluidly than an older generation. Older generations are more likely to identify as gay and lesbian, where when we look at people who are 18 to 34, it's huge, the number of people who identify as bisexual compared to gay or lesbian. And while these numbers are also still small, when compared to someone 35+, it's almost triple that of people who identify as pansexual or queer or asexual. So there's just so many rich different dimensions of the LGBTQ+ community, and that changes based on age and demographics. So it's really important to understand these kinds of degrees in which people identify within these different communities. I'll touch on how people then express these identities later on, but it's important to note here that the majority of people 18 to 34 identify as bisexual within the LGBTQ+ community. When we took a look at gender, again, unsurprisingly, 18 to 24-year-olds are more likely to identify as trans or non-binary compared to the general population, almost 5 times as likely. Again, this is a very staggering number, in that such huge populations of 18 to 24-year-olds are becoming more comfortable expressing themselves in the real world. But we wanted to find out how people are expressing themselves and where people are expressing themselves. And so we asked people how they expressed their sexuality and gender identity in the workplace, online, and with friends and family. We didn't include it in this presentation, but people express themselves very openly online and with their friends and family. It was almost all of LGBTQ plus people. But when we took a look at the workplace, only 42% of LGBTQ plus people are actually out in the workplace. And that's a staggering number. It's incredible. You think that in countries like Australia or the US or Canada that are so progressive and they're so welcoming of our community that people would feel safe to express themselves at work. But that's just not the case, in that people feel unsafe or they don't feel secure enough to kind of freely express themselves at work. And so we can't exactly pinpoint why people are not out at work, but we did ask a few questions and we did cut the data in a couple different ways to kind of understand what might be getting in the way of that. And so those who identify outside of traditional binaries of sexuality are less likely to be open at work. So people like gay men, lesbian women, or transgender women or transgender men, they're more likely to be out at work. But when you look at the opposite end of that, bisexual men are the least likely to be out at work. And there's, again, so many stigmas around masculinity and gender. And you think about how easy it might be for someone who identifies as bisexual to communicate that at work or share that at work. It might just be an unnecessary conversation that they just don't feel comfortable with. They might feel like it might cloud people's judgment or perception of them, and they just keep it to themselves. Again, it's really incredible to think when 63% of 18 to 34-year-olds identify as bisexual within this community, only 28% of that 63 are actually out at work. It's incredible numbers, and it's really important to take that into consideration when you think about, okay, I want to engage this community, but how can you engage this community within the walls of your own organization first? We wanted to take this another step further to understand what else might be holding them back of getting in the way of expressing themselves at work. And income actually plays a huge role in that as well, in that 47% of people on a higher income are more likely to be out at work versus 34% on a lower income. And so again, this kind of alludes to the fact of someone who might be at an entry-level role. They might not have been at the company for very long. They're just coming into their career. They might not feel comfortable expressing their sexuality because they're just trying to get their bearings straight. And so when we think about creating safe spaces, it isn't just for safe spaces for people who've been at the organization. It's the second you walk in the door of your job, you should feel safe to express yourself and be your completely true self at work. So to wrap this section up, the future of queer identities is completely fluid. So as you want to address these audiences, reflect the way that you represent and engage with them and move away from really one-dimensional perspectives. There's so many different ways to be queer, and it's important that we reflect those different dimensions of our community. And the most successful brands will first foster truly inclusive spaces for their LGBTQ plus employees before going out to market. You need to understand how your workplace fares today and implement a long-term strategy to improve DE&I tomorrow. And that groundwork in DE&I within your own organization will help impact more greater work that you bring to market in the future. So our second section is on media, and this section is focusing on how queer content is going mainstream. It should be unsurprising to anyone that technology has come a long way and that 96% of LGBTQ plus people age 11 to 16 has said that the internet has helped them understand their own identity, their own sexuality. You know, nowadays people have access to so much information, access to so many different communities. It's very easy to kind of understand and distill how you're feeling by simply logging onto the internet. You know, 30 years ago, if you were feeling some kind of way, you couldn't as easily connect with your community that you can today. And therefore, technology has played a huge role in how queer people understand themselves and the communities that they exist within. But when we think about queer media, some people might say that, oh, it's only for queer people. If I do a queer storyline, it's only reaching queer people. But 60% of people who don't identify as LGBTQ plus seek out queer media. And so what I mean by queer media, it can be movies with queer characters. It can be queer influencers in social spaces. It can be queer characters on video games. It can be anything focusing around our community, whether it be fictional or non-fictional. And 60% of people who identify as something other than LGBTQ plus cisgender, heterosexual people seek out queer media. That's a staggering number. And this has been so influential in some of the conversations we're having with brands where they feel like representation might not speak to a wider audience, but it does. And audiences want to see this kind of representation in the work. Now, we love to break everything down by age to understand differences. And the most staggering factor was that 85% of non-LGBTQ plus Gen X audiences want to see queer content. Of course, that number gets smaller as we get a bit older, but that's staggering because every brand is trying to reach Gen Z audiences. So if you have a Gen Z brief, you inherently have a queer brief because that audience is the queerest generation, and the people who don't identify within our community, they want to see more of our community. So queerness and representation is so intrinsically linked to younger generations, and it's really important that we understand this kind of representation as we put out work. And so we asked survey respondents a few questions on what representation means to them, why it's important. And so one quote that came back that was really interesting is that you can't be what you can't see. We deserve content that tells our stories as full human beings. And it's really important because people will never experience other identities, other communities, if they can't see it in mass media. Communications, movies, entertainment, it plays such a pivotal role in understanding stories outside of our own frame of living. And having queer representation is truly important so that people can discover their own identities, but other people have understanding of our community as well. And so we broke it down in different places that people are actually seeking out this kind of queer content. Like, what channels are people going to? Again, unsurprising that most people are going to social media, television, and movies, and that figure kind of gets lower as we get down to things like radio and video games. While people might not go to places like podcasts or video games as much to seek out queer content, that's actually an advantage for an advertiser or a brand looking to reach a queer audience, because queer audiences spend a lot of time on these channels, but there's not a lot of queer narratives that exist within them. So obviously within social media or film and TV, these are really cluttered spaces. There's so much content, but brands have an opportunity to carve out their own space in places like podcasts or video games to kind of create that kind of representation where people don't expect to see it. And of course, we're breaking things down by age here. So social media, unsurprisingly, 65% of 18 to 34-year-olds go there to seek out queer content. But then if we go down the line, places like magazines and newspaper rank a little bit higher for people above the age of 35. But like I said, video games is ranking way higher against a younger audience compared to that older audience. Again, if you're looking to reach a younger Gen Z audience who happens to play video games, it could be a really interesting place for you to play in. And so within the full report, we kind of break down each individual touch point in greater detail. I won't do that today because it's a lot of information, but we broke down a couple for you here. So social media obviously is such an important place for brands to show up. It reaches basically everyone, and everyone goes to these places to see these kinds of influencers. And it's given way to a lot of interesting characters in that we see people like Jojo Siwa or Jonathan Van Ness. They're really becoming these public faces, and they're creating communities on social media. When we asked different subsects of the LGBTQ plus community, we found like bi women or lesbian women index really high against social media. And a lot of people were seeking out queer influencers specifically on this touch point. People of color, people with disabilities, they want to see themselves reflected back at them. And social media is a great way that you can find influencers that represent you. They can either be mega influencers like Jonathan Van Ness, or they can be more niche. But if you go online, there's so many rich communities there, and people can always find people that they identify with. Another really interesting one is video games. And this offers kind of a new space for people to create characters that are really different to maybe how they represent themselves in the real world. So people who are gender nonconforming or people with a disability index really highly against video games because it allows them to be something that they might not be comfortable being in the real world. It's such an important place, and we're seeing a lot more representation here. I know Sims just released a line of characters, of trans characters. They had top surgery scars, they had binders on. And again, this kind of representation is really incredible because it's something that we didn't have in video games, and so many people play video games. And so again, it's a really rich, interesting channel that's kind of emerging in real time. But with all of that, the quality and the quantity of content still needs to improve. So while a lot of people are looking to these channels to see themselves represented, only about 38% are actually satisfied by the way that they see themselves represented in media. And 2 in 3 people from the LGBTQ plus community would like to see more LGBTQ plus content, more representation. And it's really critical that we get that representation right. And 77% of survey respondents agreed with the statement that queer content should be made by queer teams. This whole idea of nothing about us, nothing without us, because if you don't have people in the room who have lived these experiences, who have lived these stories that you're trying to tell, you're going to miss the mark. You're not going to hit on the things that you need to hit on. And it might come across tone deaf. You know, we need to make sure that we're telling the story in an accurate way and it's accurately representative. So just simply have people in the room, ask the question, engage with the community, make sure that what you're saying is truly representative of the people that you're trying to tell the story for. So to summarize this section, there's 3 key points. So as technology develops, so will people and how they explore their identities, and consider the role that you want to have in facilitating this exploration. You know, things like the metaverse and blockchain, it's all very flashy words, and it's really exciting for marketers, but don't just do it for the sake of doing it. Actually have some intent and some purpose. Make sure that you're creating spaces for the communities. You're not just showing up and taking up space as a brand. LGBTQ plus media will become a very established part of mainstream media. And so as you're starting to think about how you're showing up in different touch points and channels, think about the platforms that over-index against this audience, think about where this content is thriving, and think about where you have opportunity to start to build this content as you start to think about how you're planning your media. And then lastly, people are going to expect more authentic, high quality representation. There's so much more that needs to go into it beyond just slapping a rainbow. You can't just throw a gay person on that ad and expect to check a box. It really needs to be well thought out. It needs to be curated. It needs to be representative of this community. So you need to make sure that you're consulting the community, you're talking to the community, and you're learning from the community. It's okay to make mistakes, and the brands that do make the mistakes, that are able to amend, apologize, figure out what went wrong, and take the time to understand, they're going to do the best. It's okay if you don't get it right, but it's more important that you learn and grow, and we kind of go on this journey together. The last section is communications. So we all know, I'm sure you guys are all seeing it these days, is that when Pride rolls around, so do the rainbow flags. We see them everywhere. It seems everyone updates their logo. Everyone wants to join the party, which is great. Don't get me wrong. We love to see the representation. We love to see the support, but it's only skin deep, and it needs to go deeper than just simply updating your logo during Pride Month. And so we asked survey respondents, what do you want to see more of? What have you seen in the past? And things like updating the logo during Pride Month. A lot of people are seeing that in the past, but what people want to see more of in the future that they haven't seen in the past as much is things like raising awareness for issues and legislation impacting the community, raising money for the community, featuring characters within your ads so that it isn't just skin deep. You aren't just sending out a statement for the sake of PR. You're actually making actionable change for this community. And so there's a few different ways that we can go about doing that, specifically through advertising. The first is using your platform to raise awareness for the issues affecting this community. The second is to feature more authentic representation of characters within your communications, within your advertisements. And then lastly is to support charities, organizations, and dedicate some profits to actually go back to this community. So if that you're going to tell our story, our community gets some benefit to that as well. So we'll dive into these 3 things a little bit deeper. The first is issues affecting LGBTQ plus people. So I won't play these examples because they're quite long, but there's kind of 2 ways that we can do it. The first is either speaking out or storytelling. So ways that brands have done this really well, this Ford example in the bottom left hand, they had released a new truck and it was blue. That's all they did. And for some reason, someone on Twitter found that that shade of blue was really quite gay. Don't ask me why. I didn't know the color blue was gay, but they kind of just bashed and was like, oh, this color's really gay. And so what Ford did is they took a stance on this kind of hate speech online, and they came out with the Very Gay Raptor, in that they painted their truck this kind of very colorful rainbow, and they started carting it around at pride parades. They started addressing that kind of hateful comments online, and they really stood for the community, and they've done so for a long time. And so it's a really beautiful example of a company that kind of got behind this community in a really meaningful way, and they stood out and they spoke out against online hate. I think we can send some examples off the back of this, but this is a really great example of a brand that stood up in a meaningful way. When we think about storytelling, in the top right-hand corner is an example from Gillette where it follows a trans man's first shave. It's so emotional. It's so moving, and it kind of follows this really intimate experience of having their first shave. And it's obviously so relevant to the brand, like Gillette. And it's a really impactful way of telling a story of someone that a general population might not get exposed to. They might not see this kind of personal perspective of a trans man going through this really transitional moment. And it's a really beautiful example of kind of telling the story of a member of our community. Now, when we think about storytelling, there's a few different ways that we can do it when we're talking about featuring more LGBTQ plus characters. So it kind of exists on this spectrum, these 4 different quadrants. So when we think about representation to normalization, representation is when the character's unique experiences are unique to the LGBTQ plus experience. Things like coming out, something like transitioning. It's very uniquely LGBTQ plus and having representation of those experiences. But when we think about normalization, this is where the experience of the LGBTQ plus character is presented no differently than anyone others. You know, I have to go grocery shopping. I have to clean my apartment. I have to do the same boring things that everyone else has to do. And so an example of that is just normalizing the queer experience within the rest of the population. But when we think about incidental to essential, this is the role that the character plays in the storyline. So when we think about incidental, this is where an LGBTQ plus character appears briefly in the narrative alongside a number of other characters. But when we think about essential representation, this is where the character is driving the narrative. They're the key character. They're the main character of the spot. So these are a bunch of examples that do this really well. This British Gas example features a gay couple dealing with a leak in their ceiling. Again, just normal, boring stuff that we all have to deal with. But this sort of essential representation, this Renault example is an example of a gay woman, a gay couple. They're kind of coming out, they're buying their first car, they're moving out together, and it's really a beautiful example. But then something like incidental normalization, this Chase example up at the top, this is a gay couple going to get some banking. They exist within a number of other couples, a number of other people working with Chase and Chase products. They're not pivotal to the story, and their experience isn't exactly uniquely queer. Everyone needs a bank account, but they have that kind of representation, and it's so important to have that in these kinds of spots. So this is more for when we think about telling stories and different ways that you can tell stories. And there's a number of different ways that queer people can show up in your advertising. And then lastly, this one isn't exactly rocket science. It's just giving money back to the community in different ways. So these are some great examples of campaigns that have donated and given back and amplified the audience. This example with Nix and Stonewall, it featured queer talent. It gave money back to Stonewall. It supported Stonewall's programs. You know, your organization might not be the best at supporting the community, but there are nonprofits who are dedicated to supporting our community. And so you don't necessarily need to have these huge, beautifully built out structures and programs, but rather you can partner with an organization who does do that really well, like the Pinnacle Foundation, so that you can kind of work in tandem and help them create their mission and succeed on their goals. So there's a lot of different ways that brands can get involved with the community. And those were kind of 3 key pillars that we wanted to identify. And so summarizing this into a few key points, brands will continue to have a very important impact on representation within society. So take time to understand where consumers' attitudes are, where they should shift to, and that role you have in participating in that conversation and influencing them. If you do take part in Pride, expect to be challenged on what you've done the rest of the year to earn your place. Something a lot of people always say is that Pride should be a celebration of the work that you do year round. It shouldn't just be the one single moment that you show up. And so it's a really great way to get involved, but it can't be the only way that you get involved. And lastly, being informed will be more relevant and critical than other. So understanding research like this, taking time to understand the community, talk to the community, it will be so important, because if you don't take time to understand these communities, you cannot tell our stories, you cannot participate. So take the time to understand, reach out, do your homework, because it is a really interesting place to be, but you got to do the work. And with that, I will close out. I know we're recording here. We have the barcode. The actual report itself is far more in-depth than what I covered. We've got our contact information here, myself and my co-author Zoe, and other ways that you can get in touch. And yeah, that basically sums it up.
Devin, that is absolutely fantastic. Having read the report previously, just the richness you were able to bring out in this presentation is absolutely phenomenal. I have a question for you, which I'm sure others may be interested to sort of understand as well. And it is the obviously the report was conducted across Canada, the UK, and the US. Now, prior to this call being recorded, you shared that you'd spent a good chunk of time in Australia, living in Melbourne. And I wondered whether you could make any comments around any similarities or differences you might see between the market in Australia and the international markets that were covered in this research.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And we chose those three markets because culturally they're very similar. And just for the sake of analysis and surveying, we wanted to pick markets who are very similar. But there is a lot of parallels between these markets and Australia, in that you have pockets of places that are really advanced, that are really supportive and really inclusive of this community, but you also have parts of the country that are not. And the country can often be very divided. I lived in Australia during the marriage equality vote, and I think the stat was that like 45% of Australians voted against marriage equality. We won, but we didn't win by a lot in Australia. And so I think this kind of research is so important, because we might live in a bubble that we think like representation is really important. We've made a lot of progress, but the reality is that there are parts of this country that aren't as advanced, that don't share the same values. And as a brand that might be advertising nationally, it's important to understand kind of the nuances of these communities and how they show up towards different audiences. And I think there's a lot of similarities that we can pull from these markets, and how advanced our rights are and our representation is, and where we have a lot of different places that we can grow and advance in.
Fantastic, thank you. Also, just one more question, if I may, and then if anyone else has any questions they're thinking of, perhaps they can put them forward as well. You shared the stat of only 42% of people being fully out at work, and do you have any sort of sense as to, you obviously talked about the importance of the DEI groundwork first, but was there anything else in the findings which would give some hints to organisations around what they would be thinking about doing in this space?
It's a good question. In the survey, we didn't specifically ask, if you aren't out, what would help you be out?
Yeah.
But I think, at least from my experience, when you join an organization, being a gay man or being a part of this community, you might feel isolated. And that was really the purpose behind WPP Unite and why we started, is we didn't want people to feel isolated. We didn't want them to feel isolated within their specific agencies. And I think as businesses want to create kind of these inclusive spaces, is to give platform, give resources to these communities for them to collaborate, to communicate, to collect, and kind of be this group, so that when new hires are coming in, they can see that their community has a really active presence within their organization, and it's something they want to get involved in, right? Everyone wants to kind of join communities, make friends within their workplaces. And I think by having these not to toot our own horn, but having these really robust ERG networks like WPP Unite, it kind of helps newcomers and anyone within the business feel welcome because they can see these communities thriving within the places that they work. So kind of supporting and amplifying the work that you do within an ERG is so hugely important to kind of make people feel welcome within your workplace.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to pose to Devon at this point?
I'd probably just like to add, sorry, Andrew, on that point, Devon made around Unite. I think one of the really strong features of the Unite community is the allyship as well. It is not just an EIG that exists for the community members themselves. That, you know, allies are very welcome, and the experience of being part of the EIG is a learning and contributing experience for allies. And I think as well that being part of it, you understand the diversity and the depth of the community itself. And, you know, to many of Devon's points throughout the report, that, you know, that diversity is across the broad spectrum of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's really important to bring allies in on that journey and that conversation as well, as a safe space. So that's one thing that we're also really proud of at Unite. But thank you. I would just love to say thank you, Devon, on behalf of all of the team at WPP. We're incredibly proud of this piece of work. Incredibly proud to have you and your team working on this report. It's a landmark piece for us. So thank you for taking your time and sharing it with us. And Andrew, to Pinnacle for allowing us the platform to do this as well.
Fantastic. Well, look, on behalf of the Pinnacle Foundation, thank you, Devon. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you to everyone at WPP who was involved in this groundbreaking research. We will share this presentation with our partners and also with our aspiring partners, and through the Family Hub page of the Pinnacle website also. So I wanted to say a huge thank you, and we are incredibly grateful for research which hopefully will over time lead to more people within the LGBTIQ plus community feeling included and celebrated, not only in the workplace but in representations across all media. So thank you so much for your time and for making this special presentation for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.